China is standing by Russia following an uprising over the weekend. Russia's deputy foreign minister held high-level talks in Beijing yesterday as Moscow tries to shore up support for the Kremlin. Chinese officials described the rebellion as an internal affair. State media dismissed the divisions, claiming that the West is exploiting this so-called illusion in Russia. So back to our coverage of that short-lived military revolt in Russia involving thousands of mercenary troops from the Wagner Group. Fighters from the private army were cheered by Russians after stopping their march short of Moscow. Vladimir Putin reportedly made a deal with the Wagner Group's leader, who is now said to be in exile. The situation in Russia is important to the U.S. and its support for Ukraine, as Washington looks to ensure that Russia's nuclear arsenal is kept in safe hands. So Ian Lee is watching all of this from inside Ukraine. Ian, good morning.
Good morning, Anne-Marie. Tensions had been growing between the head of the mercenary group Wagner and top Russian defense officials. And on Saturday, their war of words exploded into a mutiny.
Ukrainian soldiers took advantage of this weekend's chaos in Russia to go on the offensive, clearing Russian trenches near the town of Bakhmut. Artillery and mortarmen fired rounds to support the troops pushing forward. We're firing shells all the time because our guys are trying to get through the Russian defenses, he says. Mutiny erupted Saturday morning when Wagner mercenaries crossed into Russia. They quickly seized the city of Rostov, home to Russia's southern military command, without a fight. Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin accused the Russian military of killing dozens of his men with a missile strike in Ukraine, a claim Russian officials denied. Prigozhin turned his sights to Moscow, vowing to rid the country of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and his top general. All day, the world watched the deadly convoy of Wagner fighters move closer to the capital, where soldiers deployed to the streets and locked down the city. Heavy equipment ripped up the approaching roads. On Russian state TV, President Vladimir Putin attacked Prigozhin as a traitor and called for unity. But with Wagner troops inching closer to Moscow, the Kremlin cut a deal with Prigozhin. Wagner troops would be pardoned and returned to their bases. Criminal charges against Prigozhin would be dropped, and he'd go into exile in Belarus, whose leader brokered the agreement. Rostov residents gave the failed mutineers a hero's send-off. Even Prigozhin smiled and posed for selfies on his way out. An uneasy calm has returned to the country. State TV tried to show business as usual with an undated video of Shoigu visiting a command center. But Monday morning, Putin's strongman image looks considerably weaker.
And we have the latest Western intelligence assessment on Ukraine saying the country's forces have reset as they continue to undertake major offensive operations on 3 sections across the front line. Anne-Marie?
This was unbelievable to watch it unfold over the weekend. And it ramped up and then sort of settled down much faster than I think anyone anticipated. Is there any additional insight into just why both sides agreed to a deal?
You know, we were watching these developments unfold constantly, following its every move on social media, and really were expecting some sort of clash between Wagner forces and Russian troops around Moscow. And then all of a sudden, it just evaporated. Now, there is this deal that we heard about that was brokered by Alexander Lukashenko. He's the president of Belarus. There are some questions this morning about the validity of that deal, if it's actually going to hold up. But what we're also hearing is that it's being reported that there may have been some threats to the family members of the Wagner leadership, and that may have also been a reason why they decided to back down. Interesting.
Is this the last? Does anyone believe that we will hear from Yevgeny Prigozhin, or, you know, could he mount another mutiny or sort of reconstitute his troops?
You know, his mutiny was not unpopular. There were a lot of people who supported it, a lot of troops who supported it. And, you know, one of the big fears for the Russian leadership was that soldiers would switch sides and join him, because there has been a lot of frustration over the way the war in Ukraine has been waged, especially directed at the top brass of the Russian military. And so he was saying that he was going to replace them. Now, with Prigozhin kind of disappeared, really no one knows where he is at the moment. He is supposedly going to Belarus to be an exile. You know, it seems unlikely that he can really garner the forces and the momentum again. A lot of people who supported him are now disappointed in what he did, and so it is unlikely that he'll be able to, you know, kind of bring back this mutiny again. You know, the one thing that's interesting is we heard in the interview, or in the speech by Putin, that he said that he was betrayed by Prigozhin. Well, in an interview with Putin years back, he said the one thing he can't forgive is betrayal.
Whoa. So he chooses his words carefully. There's a message there. I'm curious about how Ukrainians were watching this. You know, as it unfolded, what were the conversations that were happening there?
The Ukrainians were sitting back and watching this unfold, hoping for both sides to do well. I mean, it really reminds me of a quote from the former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin during the Iran-Iraq War, when he said he wishes both sides success. And the Ukrainians definitely wanted to see both sides rip each other apart, and which would make it easier for their operations here in Ukraine. We know that they stepped up operations on several fronts to try to take advantage of this chaos. But, you know, it is to be seen what is going to happen moving forward. Wagner forces were formidable. When I speak with different soldiers across the front line, they said those were the toughest troops that they faced. So with the Wagner forces presumably going to be absorbed by the Ministry of Defense, will they have that same fighting spirit? And will the other soldiers have that same fighting spirit now that Putin, there's a little chink in his armor? He's not the strong man that everyone thought he was a week ago, years ago. I mean, he is definitely a new man now. Yeah, there's so many sort of unknowns now as we move forward. And I thought to myself, this Wagner Group, it's a completely different culture when you talk about the military. How will these soldiers be absorbed into sort of the mainstream Russian military? I don't think it's going to be an easy marriage. Let's just put it that way. But we're all watching. Ian, thank you. So, somebody else watching. Sources tell CBS News that U.S. officials were tracking a potential revolt against Putin, but they were surprised by how quickly the threat emerged. President Biden returned from Camp David yesterday after an emergency meeting with his top national security advisors. Weijia Jiang is at the White House with more. Weijia, good morning.
Good morning to you, Anne-Marie, and good morning to everybody. The National Security Advisor and President Biden's military advisor both canceled overseas trips that they had previously planned so they could attend that emergency meeting. The president also spoke with several world leaders, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, about the Russian insurrection. President Biden instructed American diplomats to engage with their Russian counterparts to make sure Moscow understood its responsibility in protecting American personnel and citizens in Russia, according to Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Blinken described the uprising as extraordinary because the conflict was internal. He said it's too soon to say how it will impact Putin's rule, but it does reveal cracks in his power. And again, keep in mind the greatest threat is Russia's arsenal of nuclear warheads and his nuclear ambitions. And so that is something that the U.S. is obviously closely tracking. But Blinken says so far there's no change in Moscow's posture when it comes to nuclear weapons. Anne-Marie?
Weijia, I want to start there because according to the Federation of American Scientists, Russia has the largest stockpile of nuclear warheads on the planet. We know prior to this, there was discussion about some of those nuclear missiles being moved to Belarus, not the most stable environment. How concerned is the White House about any of these weapons falling into the wrong hands? As you know, the leader of Belarus has bragged about wanting to be the last European dictator. So he's perhaps one of the last people that you would want to be sort of babysitting nuclear weapons.
Right, but just because he has them doesn't mean he has the authority to use them. I mean, the question is whether Vladimir Putin is going to change his positioning on using these, which of course so far he has not, although there have been some indications that he was inching toward threatening the rest of the world, essentially, not just Ukraine, with them. So I think that, you know, it's not about where they're stored right now, but certainly, as you mentioned, that is not exactly putting people at ease, but again, these are Russian nuclear weapons, and so all eyes are on Putin.
So, Secretary of State Antony Blinken joined Face the Nation yesterday. I want to play some of what he said there.
Prigozhin himself, in this entire incident, has raised profound questions about the very premises for Russia's aggression against Ukraine in the first place, saying that Ukraine or NATO did not pose a threat to Russia, which is part of Putin's narrative, and it was a direct challenge to Putin's authority. So this raises profound questions. It shows real cracks.
So, what else has Blinken said about this, and are we aware of any sort of extra precautions the U.S. might be taking following this turmoil?
So, because this was so short-lived, even though it was extremely chaotic, but the two sides were able to strike a deal, and Blinken avoided a question about whether, you know, this could indicate there could be a civil war. He said that the real emphasis right now for the U.S. and NATO allies is making sure that Ukraine has the support and resources it needs to keep fighting, to defend itself, and hopefully to wrap this up. But in terms of any analysis about what this means for Putin, he was careful, but I will say that it was pretty remarkable. He was willing to say that this shows there is a crack in Putin's power. That's not typically something you hear from senior administration officials. And so he laid that out. He, you know, just pointed to the facts to support his claim, which is that this happened inside. This was not, you know, another country. This was not Ukraine. This was inside of Putin's own space that he was challenged. And so what that means ultimately, it's too soon to say. But Blinken definitely expressed how, you know, that leads to many more questions about Putin's power and how strong it really is.
Weijia Jiang, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, Russia's prime minister is urging citizens to rally behind President Putin after the country faced what he called a challenge to its stability. This comes as questions still remain about the Wagner Group and its leader after its army of mercenaries ended their revolt this weekend against the government. Our Charlie D'Agata has more on the Russian warlord.
He was a petty thief who eventually came to run a restaurant chain, earning him the nickname of Putin's chef. And yet in the past few days, he led an apparent coup attempt in the greatest threat to President Putin's 24-year rule. Yevgeny Prigozhin rose to prominence on the bloodiest battlefields of Ukraine, rallying his Wagner mercenary group to territorial victories where the regular Russian military fell in defeat, most notably in the fiercest fight of the war so far, Bakhmut. But the 62-year-old's shady criminal career began with a 12-year jail term for robbery and assault. He went on to run a string of restaurants in St. Petersburg, where he befriended Vladimir Putin and got the nickname Putin's chef. Jeff Hahn is a Russian expert at the London School of Economics.
In St. Petersburg in the 90s, where there were open bombings and assassinations, you were not a successful businessman unless you were able to offer protection or buy protection, and he seems to be someone who was offering protection.
From running crime rackets back then to troll farms now, accused of meddling in the U.S. presidential elections. Prigozhin, the FBI's most wanted since 2018. His Wagner Group of mercenaries has established a reputation for brutality, accused of atrocities around the globe, deployed to Syria to fight alongside the forces of President Bashar al-Assad. As reported by CBS's Deborah Patta, providing security for the president of the Central African Republic in exchange for lucrative gold mining contracts.
The Department of Treasury will be designating Wagner as a significant transnational criminal organization.
Things turned sour in Ukraine between Prigozhin and the Russian military elite in the late spring, calling out the Russian defense minister and a top general of starving his forces of ammunition and equipment, costing the lives of thousands. Now, after squaring off against Putin himself, banished to Belarus, what next for Yevgeny Prigozhin?
People keep saying that he's marked for assassination. There's a very good chance. I don't think it might come from the Kremlin. I think it might come from the Ministry of Defense because he embarrassed them hugely. But then again, he's been marked for assassination since the 90s.
He's not the kind of character to go into hiding, but he's now a warlord forced into early retirement. Another question is what becomes of the Wagner Group without its leader in regions like Africa and the Middle East. Emery?
Charlie, thank you.